August 15th, 1848. The greatest auction in British history begins. Inside Stowe House, 365 rooms, larger than Buckingham Palace. Everything must go. Paintings worth fortunes. Furniture that belonged to kings. 3 centuries of wealth sold in 40 desperate days. The Duke of Buckingham is dead. His debts. Over £1.5 million, equivalent to £300 million today. His creditors are circling like vultures, demanding payment. But how did one of England's richest men lose everything? The answer shocked Victorian society. 12 mistresses. While his duchess hosted glittering balls and entertained royalty, the Duke was secretly maintaining 12 women in separate houses across England. Each one demanded money. Each one needed servants, jewels, clothing. Each one had children who required education and support. The cost was astronomical. 10 to 15% of his entire income vanished into this secret world of kept women and illegitimate children. When he couldn't pay, they threatened blackmail. When he borrowed more, the debt spiral became unstoppable. For 40 days, auctioneers sold his life piece by piece. A bed that cost £1,200 went for £210. Masterpieces sold for nothing. A dynasty crumbled. This is how one man's inability to control his desires destroyed the finest palace in England. The story of Stowe begins not with scandal, but with extraordinary political success. The Temple family rose to prominence through a combination of strategic marriages, political cunning, and the simple good fortune of backing the right side during England's turbulent 17th century. By 1683, when Sir Richard Temple began transforming a modest manor house into something grander, the family had already established themselves as players in the highest circles of English power. But it was Richard Temple, first Viscount Cobham, who truly created Stowe as we know it. Born in 1675, Cobham inherited the estate at age 22 and would spend the next 50 years of his life transforming it into a statement of political philosophy rendered in stone and landscaping. He was a Whig, a supporter of parliamentary power over royal absolutism, a believer in religious tolerance, and an opponent of Stuart pretensions to divine right. And he would express these political convictions not through pamphlets or speeches, but through architecture. Cobham hired the finest architects of the early Georgian era. First came Sir John Vanbrugh, the brilliant playwright-turned-architect who had just completed Blenheim Palace for the Duke of Marlborough. Vanbrugh's work at Stowe between 1719 and 1724 established the massive scale and Baroque grandeur that would define the house. He created the north front with its towering portico, its Corinthian columns rising 40 feet to support a pediment filled with sculptural decoration. The effect was meant to evoke ancient Rome. The Republic, not the Empire, for Cobham's Whig politics celebrated republican virtue over monarchical tyranny. When Vanbrugh died in 1726, Cobham turned to James Gibbs, who added the graceful wings that flank the main house, creating interior spaces that included the elegant state dining room and the music room with its covered ceiling and perfect acoustics. Then came William Kent, who designed some of the interiors and, more importantly, began work on the gardens that would become as famous as the house itself. The gardens. I believe it's impossible to understand Stowe without understanding what Cobham created in the landscape. This wasn't simply ornamental gardening. This was political theatre on a vast scale. Working with Kent and later with Lancelot Capability Brown, who served as Cobham's head gardener from 1741 to 1751, they created what became known as the Elysian Fields, a carefully crafted landscape that guided visitors through a philosophical journey celebrating British liberty and Whig values. The Temple of Ancient Virtue, built in 1737, was a circular structure modelled on the Temple of Vesta in Rome, housing statues of Socrates, Homer, Lycurgus, and Epaminondas, the great figures of classical republicanism. Nearby stood the Temple of British Worthies, a curved monument featuring busts of 16 British heroes from Alfred the Great to William III, each chosen for their contributions to British liberty. And significantly, directly across from the Temple of Ancient Virtue, Cobham built the Temple of Modern Virtue, deliberately constructed as a ruin to comment on the corruption of contemporary politics under Robert Walpole's administration. These weren't subtle statements. When King George II's wife, Queen Caroline, visited in 1732, she walked through gardens that explicitly celebrated the king's enemies and criticized his government. The political message was impossible to miss, but the artistry was so magnificent that criticism seemed churlish. By the time Lord Cobham died in 1749, he had spent approximately £200,000 on Stowe, an almost incomprehensible sum that would equal perhaps £40 million today. He had created 365 rooms, though many were still being finished. He had employed at various times the three most celebrated architects in England. He had transformed 750 acres into the most influential landscape garden in Europe, spawning imitators from Russia to Virginia. And critically, he died childless, leaving everything to his sister's son, Richard Grenville. Richard Grenville became Earl Temple in 1752, 3 years after inheriting Stowe, and he would preside over the estate's most glorious period. Temple was everything an 18th-century aristocrat should be: politically powerful, enormously wealthy, and possessed of exquisite taste. He served as First Lord of the Admiralty and as Lord Lieutenant of Buckinghamshire. His political influence was so great that he effectively controlled 7 seats in Parliament, making him a force that no government could ignore. But Temple's real passion was Stowe itself. Where his uncle had built the bones of the great house and established the gardens, Temple would refine everything to perfection. He commissioned Robert Adam, the most fashionable architect of the 1770s, to redesign the interior state rooms in the new neoclassical style that was sweeping Europe. Adam created interiors of breathtaking elegance: the state dining room with its coffered ceiling and delicate plasterwork, the state music room with walls covered in damask silk, the state drawing rooms with their precisely calculated proportions and restrained classical ornament. The south front, that massive 460-foot facade, was rebuilt to Adam's designs, creating a more unified and classical appearance. Where Vanbrugh's Baroque style had been bold and dramatic, Adam's neoclassicism was refined and scholarly, drawing on precise archaeological knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman architecture rather than the free interpretations of earlier generations. Inside, Temple assembled one of the finest collections of art and furniture in England. The picture gallery housed paintings by Titian, Rubens, Van Dyck, Claude Lorrain, and Poussin. The library contained over 30,000 volumes, including medieval manuscripts and incunabula worth fortunes in themselves. Every room was furnished with pieces commissioned from the finest cabinet makers. Thomas Chippendale, George Seddon, and William and John Linnell all worked at Stowe, creating furniture of such quality that individual pieces would later sell for thousands at auction. The china and porcelain collection filled entire rooms, Sèvres dinner services commissioned by Louis XV, Chinese export porcelain accumulated over generations, English Worcester, and Chelsea pieces. Temple owned multiple complete dinner services, each designed for different sizes of gatherings, each consisting of hundreds of pieces. The silver alone, candlesticks, tureens, wine coolers, centerpieces, represented the output of decades of London's finest silversmiths. What strikes me about this accumulation is its purposefulness. Temple wasn't simply hoarding valuable objects. He was creating a complete aristocratic environment where every element — architecture, art, furniture, porcelain, silver, books — worked together to create an overwhelming impression of taste, learning, and power. When you entertained at Stowe, you weren't just feeding your guests. You are demonstrating your position at the absolute pinnacle of British society. The estate itself was managed with similar attention to perfection. Temple employed over 400 people in and around Stow, house servants, gardeners, estate workers, gamekeepers. The annual cost of maintaining the house alone exceeded £10,000, about £2 million today, and that didn't include major building projects or additions to the collections. Temple never married, and when he died in 1779, he left Stow to his nephew, George Nugent Temple Grenville, who was created Marquess of Buckingham in 1784. The Marquess continued his uncle's traditions, serving as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and maintaining Stow's position as one of the great political houses of England. He expanded the collections further and maintained the estate in perfect condition. When the Marquess died in 1813, his son Richard inherited everything. Richard was created Duke of Buckingham and Chandos in 1822, the culmination of the family's rise to the very top of the British aristocracy. He possessed one of the greatest fortunes in England, controlled vast estates in Buckinghamshire and beyond, and stood at the centre of political and social power. And within 25 years he would destroy it all. Richard Temple Nugent Bridges Chandos. Grenville, even his name was an accumulation of family honours and inheritances, was born in 1776 into a world of absolute privilege. His father was already one of the richest men in England. The family controlled Stow, multiple estates across several counties, and wielded enormous political influence. Young Richard was educated at Eton and Oxford, travelled on the Grand Tour, and took his place in the House of Lords in 1797 as Earl Temple. By all accounts, he was intelligent, cultured, and charming. He collected art with discrimination, patronised scholars, and took his political responsibilities seriously. When he inherited in 1813, at age 37, he seemed perfectly positioned to maintain and even enhance the family's position. Instead, he began spending on a scale that made his predecessors look almost frugal. The problem started with his determination to establish himself as the greatest aristocratic patron in England. He commissioned new buildings at Stow, including a massive new entrance portico and additional wings. He expanded the collections relentlessly. More paintings, more furniture, more porcelain, more books. Every auction of a great estate would see his agents bidding, acquiring pieces that Stow didn't need, but that Richard felt a duke of his standing should possess. The gardens received similar attention. He employed hundreds of gardeners to maintain the grounds in absolute perfection. New temples were built, old ones restored. The sheer cost of keeping 750 acres of ornamental landscape in pristine condition was staggering. The flowers alone for the formal gardens cost thousands annually, but the real expense was entertainment. Richard saw himself as operating in the tradition of the great Whig aristocrats, for whom political influence flowed from social dominance, and social dominance required spectacular hospitality. His house parties became legendary. He would invite 100 guests for weeks at a time, housing them in the state bedrooms, feeding them from his collections of china and silver, entertaining them with concerts, theatrical performances, and hunts across his estate. A single dinner party might require preparations that cost hundreds of pounds. The household accounts from the 1820s show purchases of food and wine on an almost industrial scale, dozens of bottles of champagne and claret for a single evening, meats and fish and exotic fruits shipped from London at enormous expense, flowers and decorations, musicians and entertainers. When the king visited for a weekend in 1825, the cost exceeded £5,000, nearly £1 million in today's money for 3 days of entertainment. I think the crucial thing to understand is that this wasn't unusual for a great aristocrat of the period. What made Richard's situation different was that his income, though enormous by ordinary standards, wasn't actually sufficient to support this level of expenditure indefinitely. The estates generated perhaps £50,000 annually, a vast sum equivalent to £10 million today. But Richard was spending £70,000 to £80,000 per year on Stow alone before his other estates and London properties were accounted for. The deficit had to come from somewhere. And Richard, like many aristocrats of his generation, turned to borrowing. The system of aristocratic credit in early 19th century England was well established. Great estates were treated almost like sovereign entities. Their rents might fluctuate year by year, but over the long term, they represented secure value. Lenders would advance money against the estate's income, confident that even if the current owner overspent, the next generation would eventually restore balance. Richard borrowed from banks, from private lenders, from other aristocrats. He took out mortgages against his properties. He sold some outlying estates to raise cash. And the debt grew year by year, compounding and accumulating, while Richard continued to spend as though his resources were limitless. In 1822, he was created Duke of Buckingham and Chandos. The dukedom was the culmination of his family's long rise. They had gone from country gentry to viscounts, to earls, to marquises, and finally to dukes across 5 generations. Richard celebrated with typical extravagance, hosting parties that lasted for days and distributing largesse to his tenants and the surrounding towns. But there was a secret behind all this magnificence, a hidden cost that multiplied the strain on the Duke's finances and would ultimately prove catastrophic. Richard Temple Nugent Bridges Chandos, Grenville, Duke of Buckingham and Chandos, peer of the realm, Knight of the Garter, was maintaining mistresses. Not 1, not 2, but by the most reliable accounts, 12 women in varying states of official and unofficial connection to his household. Victorian society, despite its later reputation for prudishness, operated on a sophisticated system of double standards when it came to aristocratic sexuality. A man in the Duke's position was expected to have discretion, but not necessarily fidelity. A mistress, one mistress, carefully chosen and quietly maintained, was considered almost normal for a wealthy peer. What Richard was doing went far beyond the acceptable boundaries. The evidence for the 12 mistresses comes from multiple sources: family letters discovered decades later, household accounts that show mysterious regular payments, and contemporary gossip that, while often unreliable in details, shows remarkable consistency in the basic claim. What's particularly striking is the sheer financial burden these relationships represented. Each of these women required housing. Some were established in London properties, others in country cottages on the Duke's estates or nearby. Each house required furnishing, servants, maintenance. The Duke couldn't simply install a mistress in a rented room. His position demanded that even his irregular relationships be conducted with appropriate grandeur. So he was effectively maintaining 12 separate households beyond his legitimate family residence. Then there were the regular allowances, payments made monthly or quarterly to ensure each woman's financial comfort. The amounts varied depending on the woman's status, duration of relationship, and whether she had borne the Duke any children. Contemporary gossip suggested some of these allowances ran to £500 or even £1,000 annually, each one representing a significant expenditure, the total running to many thousands per year. The children were another cost. The Duke acknowledged at least some of his illegitimate offspring and made provision for their education and support. Boys needed schooling at proper institutions, girls needed dowries when they married. Each child represented a long-term financial commitment that could run to thousands of pounds over a lifetime. There were also irregular expenses: jewels given as gifts, clothing appropriate to the woman's station, medical care, travel expenses, and the payoffs occasionally necessary to smooth over complications. A particularly expensive mistress might cost £2,000 to £3,000 annually, the entire income from a substantial estate. What makes this financially catastrophic isn't just the absolute amounts, though those were considerable. It's that these were fixed costs, essentially, that couldn't be reduced without either ending the relationships entirely or reneging on commitments, something that would create scandal and potentially blackmail opportunities. So even as the Duke's debts mounted and his situation became increasingly desperate, he remained locked into supporting this parallel court of dependent women and children. His legitimate family knew. His Duchess, Lady Anna Eliza Bridges, the daughter of the Duke of Chandos, must have understood what was happening. But the aristocratic code of the era demanded that she maintain the fiction of marital harmony. She presided over Stow's social calendar, hosted the great parties, and acted as though nothing was amiss. What private resentments she harbored went unrecorded, or at least were destroyed by later generations who found the truth too embarrassing to preserve. The Duke's adult children also knew. His son and heir, Richard Plantagenet Temple Nugent Bridges Chandos Grenville, another mouthful of accumulated family names, watched his inheritance being consumed not just by extravagant living, but by his father's inability to control his personal appetites. The relationship between father and son grew strained, though they maintained public courtesy. I find it remarkable how the machinery of aristocratic discretion functioned to keep this semi-open secret from becoming public scandal. The Duke's social position was so elevated that direct criticism was virtually impossible. Newspapers couldn't report on such matters. The libel laws were written to protect aristocratic reputations. Society figures might gossip privately, but no one would make a public accusation. And the Duke himself seems to have felt genuinely entitled to maintain this lifestyle, as though his rank exempted him from the normal expectations of financial prudence or marital fidelity. To understand what was at stake, we need to properly appreciate what Stowe had become by the 1830s. This wasn't simply a large country house. It was arguably the finest aristocratic residence in England, a 3-century accumulation of architecture, art, and landscape design that represented the peak of British cultural achievement. The house itself presented different faces to different approaches. The north front, where most visitors arrived, retained Vanbrugh's dramatic Baroque portico, those massive Corinthian columns creating an entrance worthy of a temple. Emerging from your carriage, you would ascend a broad flight of steps between these columns, passing through an entrance designed to make you feel both welcomed and awed by the power and taste of your host. The entrance hall was deliberately designed to overwhelm. Picture this. You step through the main doors into a space that rises 40 feet to a coffered ceiling decorated with classical motifs in white and gold. The floor is laid with marble in geometric patterns that draw the eye forward toward the grand staircase. The walls are lined with classical statuary in niches, Roman senators, Greek philosophers, mythological figures. These weren't plaster copies, but genuine antiquities collected during multiple generations of grand tours. The grand staircase itself, rising from the entrance hall in a graceful curve, featured an elaborate wrought-iron balustrade with gilded highlights, each newel post topped with a carved and painted heraldic beast. The walls were covered in red damask, against which hung portraits of the family's ancestors by Van Dyck, Lely, and Kneller. Every element worked together to establish the family's antiquity, taste, and power before you even reached the staterooms. The state dining room could seat 60 guests at a single massive table. The ceiling featured Robert Adams' characteristic delicate plasterwork, Anthemian and palmette patterns, classical medallions, all picked out in white against a pale blue ground. 3 massive chandeliers, each containing hundreds of individual crystals, provided light that would reflect and multiply off the gilded surfaces. The walls were hung with crimson silk damask, against which were mounted massive gilt-framed mirrors that made the space seem to extend infinitely. The sideboards that lined the walls displayed plate worth a fortune, silver-gilt serving dishes, wine coolers the size of bathtubs, candelabra standing 3 feet tall. When the room was set for a formal dinner, the table would be laid with one of the Duke's multiple complete Sèvres dinner services, perhaps the blue Celeste service commissioned in Paris in the 1760s, each piece hand-painted with botanical specimens and gilded decoration. The silver for a 60-person dinner required servants working for hours simply to transport it from the strong room and position it correctly. The state drawing rooms formed a magnificent suite designed for reception and entertainment. The walls were covered in silk, one room in pale green, another in cream, a third in a delicate rose pink. The furniture, mostly by Thomas Chippendale and his workshop, included pieces of extraordinary refinement, console tables with marble tops supported by elaborately carved and gilded figures, sofas and chairs upholstered in needlework or cut velvet, cabinets displaying the Duke's collection of precious objects. The picture gallery, added in the 1770s, ran for 120 feet along the south front. Top-lit by skylights, it housed the cream of the family's art collection. Portraits by Van Dyck showed the family's Stuart-era ancestors. Landscapes by Claude Lorrain and Nicolas Poussin depicted classical scenes with that golden light that every grand tourist tried to capture. Italian Renaissance masters, a Titian portrait, a Veronese biblical scene, smaller panels by Bronzino, hung alongside Dutch genre scenes by Vermeer and Ter Borch. The collection wasn't just valuable, it was genuinely distinguished, showing generations of collecting by people who actually understood and loved art. The library occupied a double-height room designed by Robert Adam, with bookcases in mahogany reaching from floor to a ceiling nearly 30 feet above. Over 30,000 volumes filled the shelves, the accumulated intellectual wealth of a family that had always taken scholarship seriously. Medieval manuscripts bound in velvet and clasped with silver-shared space, with leather-bound first editions of Shakespeare and Milton, scientific works from the age of Newton, and the latest publications from every field of learning. A library table 20 feet long dominated the center of the room, where scholars invited by the Duke could work on research projects supported by his patronage. The music room featured walls covered in damask in a shade called Pompadour pink, with white and gold plasterwork creating panels and medallions. A Baroque ceiling painting by Antonio Verrio showed classical gods and muses celebrating the arts. The room housed a chamber organ by Christopher Schreider, one of the finest instrument makers of the 18th century, along with harpsichords, pianofortes, and cases of sheet music representing 2 centuries of musical taste. Perhaps most impressive were the state bedrooms, not just rooms for sleeping, but complete apartments, each consisting of a bedchamber, dressing room, and closet. The grandest, reserved for royal visitors, featured a bed that had cost £1,200 in 1780, about £240,000 today, just for one piece of furniture. The bed's canopy was embroidered silk with gold thread, supported by posts carved as classical columns and topped with carved and gilded plumes. The bedroom's walls were covered in matching embroidered silk panels depicting classical scenes. Every element, the carpet, the furniture, the fireplace surround, the ceiling decoration, was coordinated to create a perfect whole. Imagine yourself as a guest being shown to this room. You've already passed through halls and corridors, hung with masterpieces, walked on carpets worth small fortunes, seen wealth displayed with such casual abundance that it seems almost natural. And then you're given this apartment, designed and decorated with more care and expense than most people's entire homes. The message was clear. The Duke of Buckingham and Chandos operated on a different plane of existence from ordinary humanity. But perhaps Stow's greatest achievement wasn't the house itself, but the landscape that surrounded it. The 750 acres of gardens represented the most influential example of the English landscape garden movement, a revolution in garden design that rejected the formal geometric layouts of French and Italian gardens in favor of apparently natural landscapes that were actually carefully contrived to appear artless. Working with William Kent and later Capability Brown, Lord Cobham had created something entirely new, a garden that told stories and expressed ideas through its layout and buildings. This wasn't decoration, it was philosophy rendered in earth and stone. The gardens were organized as a carefully choreographed journey. Visitors would follow paths that seemed to wander naturally through the landscape, but were actually precisely planned to create specific views and sequences of discovery. You were meant to read the garden as you might read a book, each vista and building contributing to an overall narrative about British liberty, classical virtue, and political philosophy. The Elysian Fields formed the emotional and intellectual center of the composition. Here, in a valley through which flowed the river Styx, artificially rooted and named for dramatic effect, stood the Temple of Ancient Virtue and the Temple of British Worthies. The Temple of Ancient Virtue was a perfect circular temple in the Ionic order, containing statues of Homer, Socrates, Lycurgus, and Epaminondas, representing poetry, philosophy, law, and military valor in their purest classical forms. The Temple of British Worthies, facing it across the valley, was a monument unique in European garden design, a curved exedra with 16 niches containing busts of British heroes. 8 were men of action and politics: King Alfred, Edward the Black Prince, Queen Elizabeth I, King William III, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake, John Hampden, and Sir John Barnard. 8 were men of thought and culture: Sir Thomas Gresham, Inigo Jones, John Milton, William Shakespeare, John Locke, Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and Alexander Pope. Each bust was accompanied by an inscription celebrating their contributions to British liberty and culture. The deliberate placement of these temples created a dialogue, ancient virtue and British achievement facing each other, suggesting that Britain had successfully inherited and even surpassed classical republican ideals. And nearby, as a sardonic comment, stood the Temple of Modern Virtue, built as a deliberate ruin to suggest that contemporary politics under Robert Walpole's administration had corrupted the ancient ideals. Beyond the Elysian Fields, the gardens extended in every direction, each area creating different moods and effects. The Grecian Valley was a vast artificial landscape where rolling lawns swept down to a valley bottom, the whole designed by Capability Brown to look like an idealized pastoral landscape from a Claude Lorraine painting. This single vista cost tens of thousands of pounds to create. The valley had to be carved out of the landscape, thousands of trees planted in carefully calculated positions, the grass sown and maintained to create the perfect texture. The octagon lake, covering 11 acres, was entirely artificial, dug by hundreds of laborers over several years. Around its shores stood a succession of temples and monuments. The Queen's Temple, a Palladian structure dedicated to friendship and female virtue. The Gothic Temple, a medieval revival building that predated the Gothic revival movement by decades. The Temple of Concord and Victory, celebrating British military triumphs. Each building was an architectural masterpiece in miniature. The Palladian Bridge, for instance, was a covered bridge based on Palladio's design for a bridge in Vicenza, creating a perfect classical composition reflected in the water. The Temple of Friendship was a Doric pavilion containing a statue of friendship crowning love and virtue. The Bourbon Tower, a medieval-style structure, offered views across the entire estate from its top. What's extraordinary about these garden buildings isn't just their beauty, but their sheer expense. Each temple required its own architectural design, foundation work, construction in stone or brick, decoration, and ongoing maintenance. The Palladian Bridge alone cost £3,000 to build, about £600,000 today, for what was essentially a decorative element in a garden. The total investment in the gardens over the 18th century exceeded the cost of the house itself. I think what's important to understand is that these weren't simply expensive ornaments. In 18th century aristocratic culture, a great landscape garden was a statement of cultural sophistication, political philosophy, and social position as important as the house itself. When you invited guests to Stowe, you didn't just show them the state rooms, you conducted them on a carefully planned tour of the gardens that might take half a day, during which the buildings and vistas would unfold as a carefully constructed argument about taste, learning, and values. The gardens required an army to maintain. Capability Brown, during his years as head gardener, employed up to 60 workers full-time, with additional labor hired for specific projects. Even after the major construction ended, the gardens needed constant work: grass to mow, hedges to trim, paths to maintain, buildings to repair, flowers to plant in the formal areas near the house. The annual cost of garden maintenance in the early 19th century exceeded £5,000, about £1 million today, every year, simply to keep the landscape looking perfect. To understand the full scope of what the Duke of Buckingham was trying to maintain, we need to examine how Stowe actually functioned as a living household in the 1820s and 1830s. This was a community of hundreds of people, organized with the complexity of a small military installation and the luxury of a royal court. The household staff numbered over 200 people resident in the house or its immediate outbuildings. At the top of this hierarchy stood the house steward, who managed the entire indoor establishment and controlled budgets that ran to tens of thousands of pounds annually. Under him served a complex web of specialized servants, each with precisely defined duties. The kitchen establishment alone employed over 30 people. The head chef, usually French and paid an enormous salary by servant standards, commanded a brigade of under-chefs, pastry cooks, roasting cooks, sauce cooks, and kitchen maids. The scale of cooking required to feed not just the family but their guests and the upper servants was industrial. On a day when the house had 100 guests for dinner, the kitchens might prepare 15 different courses, each consisting of multiple dishes presented together. The still room, where preserves, cordials, and delicate confectionery were prepared, employed 6 women under a still room maid. The bakery, separate from the main kitchens, produced all the bread for the household, dozens of loaves daily, from fine white bread for the family's table to coarser varieties for the servants' hall. The brewery produced ale for household consumption, running to hundreds of gallons weekly. The butler controlled the wine cellars, which contained thousands of bottles representing the accumulated purchases of generations. The inventories from the 1830s show stocks of vintage port, claret from the finest Bordeaux Chateau, champagne from Reims, Madeira, sherry, and rare wines from Germany and Italy. The butler's responsibilities included not just serving wine, but managing this valuable liquid capital, decanting bottles at the correct moment, ensuring optimal storage conditions, and preventing theft. The housekeeper, one of the most powerful positions in the household, controlled everything related to maintaining the house's interior. Under her command worked housemaids, laundry maids, and still room maids. The laundry alone required a substantial building separate from the main house, where a dozen women worked constantly washing, starching, ironing, and mending the household linen, tablecloths, bed linens, personal clothing for family and guests, servants' livery. A single formal dinner required tablecloths 50 feet long, dozens of napkins, and countless smaller linens, all of which needed to be perfectly washed, starched, and ironed. The personal servants attending the family operated in their own hierarchy. The Duke's valet managed his wardrobe, helped him dress. Aristocratic formal wear of the period required assistance. It was essentially impossible to dress properly without help, and attended to his personal needs. The Duchess had her lady's maid, who performed similar services and also dressed her hair and maintained her jewelry. Each adult family member had personal servants, and important guests would be assigned footmen to serve them during their stay. The footmen themselves, chosen for height and good looks and dressed in elaborate livery designed in the family colours, served at table, carried messages, accompanied the family on outings, and generally provided visible evidence of the household's grandeur. A ducal household might employ a dozen or more footmen, each representing a significant expense when you counted wages, livery, food, and lodging. Beyond the house itself, the estate establishment was even larger. The gardens alone, as I mentioned, employed 60 workers during the major building phases, and never fewer than 30 even in periods of routine maintenance. The stables housed scores of horses, carriage horses, riding horses, hunters for the shooting season, along with the grooms, stable boys, and coachmen needed to care for them. The home farm, which supplied fresh meat, milk, butter, eggs, and vegetables to the household, employed farm workers, dairy maids, and poultry keepers. The gamekeepers managed the shooting on the estate, which meant not just preventing poaching, but actively rearing game birds, pheasants, partridges, in numbers sufficient to provide good sport for the Duke's shooting parties. A successful shoot might bag hundreds of birds in a day, which required year-round effort to maintain game populations at that level. All of these people needed housing. The servants' quarters in the house itself occupied entire wings, with careful gradations of accommodation reflecting the household hierarchy. Upper servants had individual rooms, lower servants shared dormitories. The estate workers lived in cottages scattered across the property, each requiring maintenance and periodic rebuilding. The Duke, as a major landowner, was expected to maintain these properties in good condition. It was a feudal obligation that came with the privileges of ownership. The annual cost of running this establishment was staggering. The household accounts from the 1830s that survived show expenditures running to £70,000 to £80,000 per year, and these were just the routine operating costs. Wages for all those servants, food for the household, fuel for heating those 365 rooms, candles and later whale oil for lighting, livery for the footmen, maintenance and repair of the building and gardens. It all added up to sums that would exhaust the income of all but the very wealthiest aristocrats. And this was before any extraordinary expenses, building projects, additions to the collections, major repairs, or the cost of the Duke's London establishment, which operated separately and had its own large staff and expenses. The entertainment costs were particularly spectacular. When the Duke hosted one of his famous house parties, 100 or more guests might descend on Stowe for a week or even longer. Each guest required a bedroom. The more important guests receiving the state bedrooms, others housed in lesser but still comfortable accommodations. Their personal servants accompanied them, requiring additional space and food. The meals served during these parties were elaborate even by aristocratic standards. Multiple courses, exotic ingredients, wines chosen from the finest bottles in the cellars. The 1825 royal visit I mentioned earlier left detailed accounts that give us a window into these costs. The king and his party stayed for 3 days. The food purchases alone, exotic fruits, vast quantities of meat and fish, hundreds of bottles of wine, cost over £1,000. Musicians and entertainers were brought from London. The house was decorated with thousands of fresh flowers. New furnishings were purchased for the rooms the royal party would occupy. Gifts were prepared for each member of the royal household. The total expenditure exceeded £5,000 for 3 days, at a time when a prosperous tradesman might earn £100 in a year. What strikes me about this isn't just the extravagance, but the sense of obligation that drove it. The Duke genuinely believed that this was what his position required. A Duke of Buckingham and Chandos couldn't simply invite guests and feed them adequately. He had to overwhelm them with the magnificence of his hospitality. His status in society depended on it, his political influence flowed from it, and his sense of self-worth was bound up in maintaining this standard. But unlike his ancestors, who had built their position over generations, and whose income roughly matched their expenditure, the Duke was living beyond his means. Every house party, every addition to the collections, every improvement to the estate added to a debt burden that was growing increasingly difficult to service. By the early 1830s, the Duke's financial situation had become critical. The debts now totaled over £1.5 million, an almost incomprehensible sum, equivalent perhaps to £300 million today. The interest payments alone consumed more than the estate's entire annual income. He was borrowing simply to pay interest on existing debts, the classic death spiral of aristocratic insolvency. The Duke's response was to double down. He couldn't reduce his expenditure because that would signal weakness and financial distress, which would destroy his credit entirely and trigger immediate demands for repayment from his creditors. The aristocratic credit system depended on maintaining confidence. As long as everyone believed the Duke was solvent and the debts merely temporary, lenders would continue to extend credit and existing creditors would accept delayed payments. But any sign of real financial failure would collapse the entire structure. So the Duke continued to spend as though nothing was wrong. The house parties continued. The art collection grew. The gardens were maintained in perfect condition. New building projects were initiated. And behind the scenes, his agents scrambled desperately to find new sources of credit, to sell outlying properties, to raise cash any way possible. Some estate sales became necessary. Properties in Ireland, smaller holdings in England, anything that wasn't part of the core Buckinghamshire estate was vulnerable. These sales brought in substantial sums, tens of thousands of pounds at a time, but the money vanished almost immediately into the debt service. The fundamental problem was that the Duke's income had a ceiling. There were only so many acres generating rent, but his spending and debt service had no limit. The situation with the Mistresses made everything worse. The Duke couldn't simply end these relationships without creating scandals that would damage him socially and politically. Some of these women had been his companions for years or even decades. They had children they claimed were his. They had his written promises of support. Breaking those promises would potentially expose him to blackmail, to public scandal, or to legal action. So he remained locked into supporting 12 separate households while his legitimate expenses consumed far more than his income. I think there's a particular tragedy in the Duke's inability to confront his situation honestly. He wasn't a stupid man. The accounts were there. He could see the debt growing. But his entire worldview, the aristocratic assumption that his status and position were eternal, that money would always somehow be available, that dukes didn't need to worry about vulgar questions of solvency, prevented him from taking the drastic action that might have saved at least some of the inheritance. His son and heir watched all of this with growing desperation. Richard Plantagenet, the Marquis of Chandos, could see his inheritance evaporating. Under English law, the heir couldn't simply take control. As long as the Duke lived, he controlled the estate and could continue to encumber it with debts. The Marquis tried to reason with his father, to convince him to retrench, to reduce expenditure, to sell Stow itself if necessary to preserve the other properties and clear the debts. The Duke refused. Stow was the family's glory, the accumulation of 3 centuries of collecting and building. Selling it was unthinkable. Reducing its magnificence was impossible. He would find another way through, he assured his son. Something would turn up. Nothing turned up. The situation continued to deteriorate. By the late 1830s, the Duke was reduced to borrowing from sources no respectable aristocrat should need to approach. Moneylenders who charged usurious rates, speculators who were essentially betting on the eventual collapse and liquidation of the estate. The terms of these loans were devastating, with interest rates of 10% or even higher, and clauses that gave the lenders first claim on the estate's assets. The Duke's health began to fail under the stress. He suffered from what contemporaries described as nervous complaints, likely depression and anxiety as he confronted the approaching ruin. His Duchess had died in 1836, sparing her the final collapse, but leaving him without her stabilizing presence. He rattled around in the vast palace with its 365 rooms, maintaining the fiction of ducal grandeur while the creditors circled closer. In 1839, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He lingered for another 2 years, aware of what was coming, but unable to prevent it. On January 29, 1839, Richard Temple Nugent Bridges Chandos Grenville, 1st Duke of Buckingham and Chandos, died at Stowe House. He was 63 years old. The estate passed to his son, the 2nd Duke, who inherited a catastrophe. The debts now totaled £1.5 million. The annual income from all the estates combined was perhaps £50,000, not even enough to pay the interest on the debts. Stowe itself required £10,000 annually simply to maintain in minimum condition, and that was before any question of continuing to live there in the style the family had always maintained. Richard Plantagenet Temple Nugent Bridges Chandos Grenville, 2nd Duke of Buckingham and Chandos, inherited in 1839, facing an impossible situation. He was 50 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life watching his father destroy the family's position. Now he had to deal with the consequences. His first action was to attempt to negotiate with the creditors. Surely some arrangement could be reached, a payment plan, a partial forgiveness, something that would allow the estate to survive intact. But the creditors had been patient for years, extending credit and accepting delays while the situation deteriorated. They had no interest in further delays. They wanted their money, and they had the legal right to demand it. The 2nd Duke tried to continue living at Stowe, maintaining at least the appearance of ducal grandeur. But it was impossible. The money simply wasn't there. Servants were dismissed in droves. The household that had once numbered over 200 shrank to a skeleton staff of essential workers. The gardens began to deteriorate as the army of gardeners was reduced to a handful. Rooms in the house were closed off, their furniture covered with dust sheets, their fireplaces cold. The social embarrassment was excruciating. The Duke of Buckingham and Chandos had always been one of the great hosts of English society. Now he couldn't afford to entertain. Invitations that once flowed freely were not extended. House parties ceased. The great palace stood empty and increasingly shabby as maintenance was deferred and economies enforced. The Duke tried to find a buyer for the estate. Surely someone would want to acquire Stowe, perhaps a newly wealthy industrialist looking to establish himself in society, or a foreign prince seeking an English showplace. But the problem was the debt. The estate's value, even including all the art and furniture, couldn't cover what was owed. Any potential buyer would be acquiring not just a magnificent property, but also a massive liability. By 1847, the situation had become untenable. The creditors would wait no longer. The courts were involved. The only solution was complete liquidation. Sell everything that could be sold, use the proceeds to pay as much of the debt as possible, and whatever remained, the creditors would have to accept as unsatisfied. The decision to auction the contents of Stowe must have been devastating. This wasn't just selling furniture and art. It was dismembering the accumulated cultural achievement of 3 centuries. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every book, every porcelain plate represented not just monetary value, but family history. The Titian had hung in the picture gallery for 100 years. The Sèvres dinner services had been used to entertain kings. The library contained books annotated by family members dating back to the 17th century. But there was no choice. The auctioneers were called in. The firm of Christie and Manson, the most prestigious auction house in London, would handle the sale. Their representatives spent weeks at Stowe, cataloguing everything, creating lot descriptions, preparing for what would be one of the largest country house sales in British history. The sale began on August 15, 1848. and would continue for 40 days. The catalogue ran to 537 lots. Though many lots consisted of multiple items, a lot might be a complete dinner service of hundreds of pieces, or a set of chairs, or a collection of books. In reality, tens of thousands of individual objects were being sold. They set up the auction in the house itself, moving from room to room as each was emptied. Buyers came from across Britain and Europe, dealers, collectors, aristocrats looking for bargains, speculators hoping to profit from the disaster. The crowds were so large that special trains were chartered from London to bring buyers and spectators to this funeral of a great house. The first days focused on the furniture. Lot after lot of pieces by Chippendale, by Linnell, by Seddon, the finest cabinet makers of the 18th century. A magnificent library table, 20 feet long in figured mahogany, sold for £180, a significant sum but far less than its true worth. A set of 24 dining chairs, attributed to Chippendale, went for £95. Console tables with marble tops and elaborately carved and gilded bases sold for £40 or £50 each when they had cost hundreds to make. What's striking in the auction records is how little most things brought relative to their original cost or intrinsic value. The market was flooded, too many objects being sold too quickly, too many dealers realizing they could afford to wait for prices to fall even further. A set of Sèvres porcelain that had cost £800 in Paris in 1770 sold for £120. Chinese export porcelain services sold for single-digit pounds when they had cost dozens originally. The paintings brought better prices, at least for the major works. The Titian portrait sold for £890, the Veronese for £650, but these were still fractions of what such works would bring in a normal market. The dealers knew the Duke was desperate, and they bargained accordingly. Smaller pictures, including works by respectable masters, went for almost nothing. £10, £20, sums that would barely cover the cost of the frames. The library sale took days. 30,000 volumes, lot by lot. Medieval manuscripts that should have gone to major institutions sold to dealers for hundreds when they were worth thousands. First editions, fine bindings, rare books in every field, all dispersed. The books alone had cost the family over £30,000 to accumulate. They brought perhaps £8,000 at auction. The silver went by weight as much as by artistic merit. Magnificent pieces by the finest silversmiths, objects that had taken master craftsmen months to create, were sold by the pound and often melted down for their metal content. The family's collection of plate had been valued at £15,000 in the 1830s. It brought £4,200 at auction. Watching the auction records, lot by lot, you can almost feel the anguish. These weren't just objects being sold. This was history being dismembered. The bed from the state bedroom, which had cost £1,200 to make, sold for £210. The organ from the music room went for £110. Carpets that had cost hundreds sold for tens of pounds. And still, after 40 days of selling, after 537 lots had been hammered down, after the house had been stripped of everything that could be removed, the total realized was only £75,400. Against debts of £1.5 million, this was barely a down payment. I think what makes this particularly tragic is that much of what was sold was scattered forever. Some major works went to museums or to collectors who valued them, but much simply disappeared into the trade, bought by dealers who split up sets and resold items individually. Dinner services were broken up, chairs from sets were separated, collections carefully assembled over generations were dispersed to the four winds. The family attempted to buy back a few pieces, items of particular sentimental value, or portraits of ancestors. But they had almost no money, and even these modest repurchases added to the debt burden. After the sale of the contents, Stowe stood empty. 365 rooms, stripped of furniture, art, books, even curtains and carpets in many cases. The second Duke couldn't afford to live there. He moved to a smaller property and tried to find a buyer or tenant for the house itself. But who would want it? The building was magnificent but also monstrously impractical. Heating it would cost thousands annually. Maintaining it properly required an army of servants. Using it for any purpose would require refurnishing at least some rooms, which meant massive capital investment. And all of this would be on a property that still carried debt encumbrances that limited what an owner could do with it. For a few years, Stowe stood virtually abandoned. The gardens, without their army of maintainers, began to deteriorate rapidly. Grass grew long, hedges became shaggy, paths were obscured by weeds. The temples and monuments, without regular maintenance, started to decay. Stone crumbled, roofs leaked, wooden elements rotted. The Elysian fields, so carefully contrived to look naturally perfect, looked merely neglected. The second Duke died in 1861, having spent the last years of his life in much reduced circumstances. The title passed to his son, the third Duke, who promptly sold the Stowe estate to pay off remaining debts. The buyer was a relative, the Duke of Chandos, who paid £80,000 for the property, a fraction of what it had cost to create, but all that it would bring in its current condition. The third Duke, having sold Stowe, tried to maintain some semblance of ducal status from other properties, but the family's position was broken. Without Stowe, without the great collections, without the financial resources to play the political and social role that had once been theirs, they faded from prominence. The dukedom itself would eventually become extinct in 1889 when the third Duke died without male heirs. What happened to Stowe after the sale is its own story. The Chandos ownership was brief. In 1921, the house and grounds were sold again, this time for use as a private school, Stowe School, which continues today. The conversion to a school saved the building from demolition, which was seriously considered in the early 20th century, but required alterations that changed the interior significantly. The temples and monuments in the gardens fared worse. For decades, they were simply left to decay. By the mid-20th century, many were ruins, roofs gone, walls crumbling, decorative elements fallen and lost. It wasn't until the National Trust became involved in the 1960s that serious restoration began. Today, the gardens are owned by the National Trust and open to the public, with ongoing restoration work slowly bringing the temples back to something like their original condition. The house itself, still owned by Stowe School, is partially accessible to the public. Some of the major state rooms have been restored and can be visited, but it's a shadow of what it was. You can see the bones of the magnificent palace, but the life is gone. The rooms are empty of the furniture and art that once filled them. The social world that animated these spaces has vanished entirely. Some of the dispersed collections can be traced. The Titian portrait ended up in a museum in New York. The Veronese is in a private collection in Europe. Some of the furniture turns up occasionally at auction, identified by scholars who recognize the pieces from old photographs and sale catalogues. But most has vanished into untraceable private ownership, the connection to Stowe forgotten. The full story of the Duke's mistresses only emerged decades after the events, when family papers that had been carefully suppressed were finally examined by historians. What became clear was that the financial drain of maintaining this parallel court had been catastrophic, but also that it reflected a pattern of behavior that the Duke seemingly couldn't or wouldn't control. The evidence suggests the relationships began early in his adult life and continued until his death. Some of the women were actresses or opera singers, professions that put them in contact with wealthy men, and that carried an assumption of sexual availability in the social codes of the era. Others were from respectable but impoverished gentry families, women whose lack of fortune made them vulnerable to offers of protection and support. The Duke seems to have genuinely cared for at least some of these women. The letters that survive show real affection, concern for their welfare, interest in their children. This wasn't simply crude sexual exploitation, though the power imbalance was extreme, and the women had little choice but to accept the arrangement or face destitution. It was a complex system of mutual dependence, where the women received financial security, and the Duke received companionship, sexual access, and the satisfaction of playing the generous protector. But the costs were ruinous. The household accounts show regular payments listed under innocuous headings: allowances, pensions, charitable disbursements, that actually went to support these women. The amounts varied, but typically ranged from £200 to £1,000 annually per woman. With 12 women, plus housing costs, education for children, and irregular expenses, the total annual cost was at minimum £5,000 to £8,000, about 10 to 15% of the estate's entire income, simply maintaining this parallel structure. What makes this particularly damaging isn't just the direct financial cost, but the fact that it represented fixed obligations that couldn't be reduced. The Duke's legitimate household expenses could theoretically be cut: dismiss servants, close rooms, reduce entertainment. But the mistresses couldn't simply be dismissed without creating exactly the sort of scandal that would destroy what remained of his credit and reputation. Some of the women did attempt blackmail when the Duke's payments became irregular during his final financial crisis. Threatening letters survive, demanding continued support, and hinting at public exposure if payments ceased. The Duke paid, adding to his debts because the alternative, public scandal during a period when he was trying to maintain creditor confidence, would have been worse. The human cost was also severe. The Duchess, living with the knowledge of her husband's infidelities, but bound by social convention to maintain the fiction of marital harmony. The legitimate children, watching their inheritance being consumed by their father's inability to control his appetites. The mistresses themselves, dependent on the continued favor of a man whose financial position was collapsing, facing the prospect of being discarded and left destitute. I believe what this reveals is how the aristocratic system, with its assumptions of male sexual privilege and its double standards about fidelity and discretion, could become financially as well as morally destructive. The Duke felt entitled to maintain these relationships as part of his aristocratic privilege. His wealth and position made it possible, at least initially. But unlike his ancestors, whose resources were sufficient to support such behavior, he was operating at the limits of his income, and these additional demands pushed him beyond sustainability. The fall of Stowe and the ruin of the Buckingham Dukes offers several painful lessons about wealth, status, and sustainability. First, and most obviously, living beyond one's income is ultimately catastrophic, regardless of how wealthy one appears. The Duke's annual income of £50,000 would have made him phenomenally wealthy by the standards of his era, richer than 99.9% of the British population. But when set against expenditures of £70,000 to £80,000 annually, that wealth was meaningless. The deficit had to be covered by debt, and debt compounds until it becomes unserviceable. Second, aristocratic status created pressures that made financial prudence almost impossible. The Duke couldn't simply reduce his expenditure, because doing so would signal weakness and financial distress, which would destroy his credit and trigger the exact collapse he was trying to avoid. He was trapped in a system where maintaining appearances was essential to maintaining credit, but maintaining appearances required spending that made his situation worse. Third, the particular burden of supporting multiple mistresses reveals how personal behavior that might seem like a private matter can have public and financial consequences. The Duke's sexual arrangements consumed 10 to 15% of his income, enough that, if that money had been saved or used to reduce debt, the catastrophe might have been avoided or at least delayed. But the entitlement of aristocratic male privilege made those arrangements seem normal and acceptable, even as they contributed to financial ruin. Fourth, the pace of social change in the 19th century was destroying the economic foundations of traditional aristocracy. The temples had built their position over 3 centuries, when wealth was based primarily on land and rents were stable and reliable. But by the 1830s and 1840s, the world was changing. Would automatically produce financial security was becoming obsolete. What strikes me most about this story is the sheer waste. Stowe was a genuine cultural achievement. The architecture, the gardens, the collections represented the best of British taste and artistic patronage over 3 generations. It should have endured, passing from generation to generation, accumulating more history and significance. Instead, it was destroyed in essentially 1 generation by a man who couldn't live within his means and couldn't control his personal behavior. The dispersal of the collections was a cultural catastrophe. Sets carefully assembled over decades were broken up. Works of art that had hung together, creating specific effects and meanings, were scattered. A library that represented 3 centuries of intellectual engagement was sold off in job lots. Much was simply lost, melted down, broken up, destroyed, or so thoroughly divorced from its context that its significance was forgotten. The human cost was also severe. The second Duke spent the last years of his life dealing with his father's debts and watching the family's position disintegrate. The third Duke inherited a title without the resources to maintain it. The servants who had devoted their lives to the household were dismissed without pensions. The tenants who depended on the estate for their livelihoods faced uncertainty. Today, when you visit Stowe, you can see the magnificent bones of what it was. The house, though altered by its use as a school, still impresses with its scale and architectural quality. The gardens, partially restored by the National Trust, still contain those extraordinary temples and monuments. You can walk through the Elysian Fields and see the Temple of Ancient Virtue and the Temple of British Worthies, restored to something like their original condition. But you're seeing a restoration, a partial reconstruction of what was lost. The life that animated these spaces. The Duke entertaining 100 guests, the orchestras playing in the music room, the conversations in the library, the 1,000 servants maintaining the complex machinery of aristocratic life. That's gone forever. What remains is beautiful but also melancholy, a reminder of what was lost through financial recklessness and personal excess. The legacy of Stowe isn't really about architecture or gardens, magnificent as those are. It's about the limits of wealth, the consequences of living beyond one's means, and the way that personal behavior, in this case, the Duke's inability to control his sexual arrangements, can destroy not just individual lives, but cultural achievements that should have endured for centuries. I think we can also see in this story a preview of what would happen to the British aristocracy more broadly over the following century. The Temple Grenville family's collapse in the 1840s was early and dramatic, but the pattern would repeat across the country as land-based wealth became insufficient to support traditional aristocratic lifestyles, as taxation increased, and as social changes made the old certainties obsolete. By the early 20th century, country houses across Britain would be demolished or converted to other uses, their collections sold, their parks broken up. The Stowe story was a warning that went largely unheeded. Today, Stowe School educates children in rooms where dukes once entertained kings. The gardens are maintained by the National Trust rather than by hundreds of private employees. The house is open to tours rather than closed to all but the social elite. In some ways, this is a better outcome. More people can appreciate what was created, and the building and gardens are preserved for future generations rather than being demolished or allowed to decay. But it's impossible not to feel some sense of loss. 3 centuries of collecting, building, and cultural patronage were destroyed in a few decades. A family that had helped shape British history fell from power and eventually into extinction. And the agent of this destruction wasn't war, revolution, or plague. It was simply a man who spent more than he earned, and who couldn't control his personal appetites. The warning is clear: wealth without discipline is temporary, status without sustainability is hollow, and the grandest palace ever built cannot survive financial recklessness. Stowe stands today as both a triumph of British architecture and landscape design, and as a monument to the catastrophic consequences of aristocratic excess and financial irresponsibility. The Duke's 12 mistresses were the specific burden that pushed an already strained situation into outright catastrophe. But the deeper problem was the entire system of aristocratic life, the assumption that spending would always be matched by income, that status and position were permanent, that the rules governing ordinary mortals didn't apply to dukes. That system was already dying by the 1840s. The Duke of Buckingham and Chandos just had the misfortune to be one of its most spectacular casualties.